Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, SEG 575 Mobile Dynamic Analysis. My name is Jessica Gallus of SANS, and today's featured speaker is Jeroen, Beckers. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the Q&A window located on the control panel at any time. Please note that a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be made available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS webcast archives. And with that, I'd like to turn the webcast over to Jeroen.
All right, thank you, Jessica, for that introduction. Quickly have to change a cable. Hold on. All right, so indeed, my name is Jeroen Beckers. That's quite a difficult name to pronounce in English, so I put a kind of a easier way to say it on top. So Y-E-R-O-O-N, Jeroen. Who am I? Well, I'm the author of the SEG 575 course, which is, of course, the mobile course for SANS. I will also be co-teaching this in July, and then normally we'll be teaching it in a few months later. I've presented at quite a few SANS events already, some community nights, a few hackfests already, typically on mobile, of course, since that's my specialty. During the day, I work for Enviso. Enviso is a European cybersecurity company, which is also the company that was founded by Erik van Buggenhout, another one of SANS great instructors for the 599 and 699 course. Within Enviso, I'm responsible for all the mobile stuff, so defining methodologies, performing quality assurance, but also R&D, which is, of course, the fun part, figuring out how stuff works and creating new tools to make everything work. In my spare time, I'm also a volunteer for OWASP, and then more specifically for the Mobile Testing Guide and the Mobile Application Security Verification Standard, so the MASVS. The MASVS is a checklist, a verification standard, which contains over 80 controls to verify if your application is in a secure state or not, so you can work towards compliance if you develop an application. Or as a security auditor, you can use that verification standard, of course, to verify if an application is secure. And then the Mobile Testing Guide, it's over 1,000 pages long by now, and it actually explains in depth how to perform all those checks from the MASVS. Right, so what am I going to talk about today? Well, dynamic analysis, of course, that's the subject of this webcast. I only have an hour, so that's quite short to explain all the ins and outs of dynamic analysis for mobile. So you will only get a sneak peek of the possibilities for mobile dynamic analysis. But I hope I can pique your interest and that you can continue on your own to figure out all the exciting tools and all the exciting possibilities. Or you can join us for the 575 course, of course, and then we can go through everything more in depth. So I'll give a little bit of input on what dynamic analysis is, for those of you that don't know it yet. I'll go over the tools, not all of them, because there are many, many tools, but the most interesting ones or the ones that are the most relevant currently. And then finally, there should be some time for Q&A. Now, I also have the question window open to my right. So if you have a specific question during the talk, I can answer it immediately, or otherwise I'll just keep it for the end of the talk and come back to it. Right, so a little bit of information on the 575 course, just to explain what you would see if we would have a full 5 days to go over everything. So the course is focused on Android and iOS. I think it's safe to say that these two platforms have won the mobile wars. You don't see Firefox OS or Symbian or Windows Phone, maybe a little bit of Windows Phone. But basically, Android and iOS are the two mobile operating systems, of course. The course starts from a really basic point of view, so the architecture of Android devices, of applications, how they interact. But it also continues on to very advanced stuff, like how do you attack an application, how do you get a man-in-the-middle position, how do you reverse engineer malware. So even if you already have experience with mobile, you can still learn a lot of new things. We also take a look from both the offensive side and the defensive side. Just like with the MASVS, it's useful to both use it as an attacker to see, okay, where are the actual vulnerabilities inside the application, as well as the defender, so the creator of the app, to see, okay, how can I properly protect my application? What would go wrong if somebody steals the devices of my employees? So that's more the defensive side. In total, there are 16 labs spread out over the course. They involve runtime labs, so actually working with an Android device or an Android emulator and modifying applications, instrumenting applications, but also static analysis, figuring out how backups work, a lot of interesting stuff there. The mobile scene is constantly changing. It's quite a difficult scene and quite an interesting one for me, because every year we get a new Android version and a new iOS version. So that's quite a lot. It's much more than your typical Windows update or your typical Linux-based update. So every year, new versions come out. And it also means that the tools actually have to follow along with those new versions. Because it changes so often, I also created an online portal to try to keep everything up to date and relevant. Because, well, it's quite difficult to push out multiple courseware updates each year. So that's why I use the online portal to keep you up to date with relevant information. So last slide on the 575. So this is the general structure of the 5 days, and then 6 days to capture the flag, as it's typical. So day one, it's really the intro day, device architecture and application interaction. What kind of CPU does Android use? What kind of it's ARM code? So what kind of no, I'm drawing a blank. So what's the CPU architecture? That's it. How do applications interact with each other? What are content providers? What are activities? What are intents? So both for Android and iOS, even though there's a lot less application interaction on iOS, you still have fully functioning apps on iOS, of course. So there's still a lot to learn there. Day two is on the stolen device threat and mobile malware. So the stolen device threat, we take the angle of what would happen, or what's the worst case if somebody steals your device. Will they be able to get in? Depends on if you have a PIN code or not, or a swipe pattern, or Touch ID. What would they be able to get out of it? So what kind of data is stored on the device, and what kind of data is maybe stored in backups of different applications? This also involves rooting a device and different kinds of jailbreak and rooting and all that stuff. Second part of the day is mobile malware. So there is a lot of mobile malware. It's rather limited on iOS, but on Android, you have so many different kinds of malware. It's impressive, and it's kind of fun to see what they do and how they abuse the ecosystem. So that's the end of day two. Day three is on static application analysis. I gave a previous webcast on static application analysis. So if you're interested in a high-level view of that, be sure to check that out. But static application analysis, of course, we take an application, we decompile it, we look for interesting pieces of code or interesting strings. We may have to get around obfuscation, stuff like that. Day four, and that's the content of this webcast, of course, is dynamic application analysis and manipulation. So today we'll focus on dynamic application analysis, and then in a future webcast, I will actually speak a bit about manipulation. There is quite some overlap, of course, but the manipulation can be quite technical and advanced, so that deserves a webcast on its own. Day five is really the offensive day. So you learn how to man-in-the-middle applications, how to get around security controls such as SSL pinning or root detection. You also create your own malware, which you can then send to a device and then interact with it to see what kind of information you can extract. And then day six, of course, is the CTF, where you can put your skills to good use and get one of those wanted SOMS coins. Right, so on to the main subject, dynamic analysis. Right, so dynamic analysis, it's the counterpart to static analysis, of course. Static analysis is decompiling the application and taking a look at the actual code without running it. Dynamic analysis is, of course, actually running the application and hopefully monitoring the application and figuring out what it does based on its behavior. If you want to figure out what it does, what its behavior is, then of course you have to, monitor stuff. So for example, you could monitor the file system to see which extra files is it trying to load. Is it maybe putting a mutex somewhere for typical like Windows malware to see if it's already ran before? How does it interact with other applications? How does it interact with the operating system? Which APIs does it use? All that stuff. So if you want to figure out how the application behaves, you have to monitor those things. Another thing for which dynamic analysis is really important is if you want to take a look at the security of the backend. It is, of course, possible if you would just extract all of the API endpoints from the application and then try to piece together correct requests for yourself. But it's much, much easier to just execute the application, get yourself a man-in-the-middle position, and just watch all the traffic coming by and then intercept it, modify it, play around with it, and hopefully find some vulnerabilities. Now, some applications actually download extra code at runtime. So this is something where static application analysis would not be enough, because at some point, you need a way to get that extra piece of code. This can be easy. Maybe it's an obvious URL inside of the application with a normal new jar file that's returned, for example. But it can also be really difficult with string obfuscation, encryption of the jar file, a lot of reflection stuff in Java. So it might be really difficult to actually find the code and be able to perform static analysis on this. Right, so static analysis, of course, is taking a look at the code. So if the code is obfuscated, it becomes much, much more difficult. I gave some examples of that on the previous webcast. But dynamic analysis might be a lot quicker to see what is actually happening instead of reversing all of the different obfuscation techniques that were used. Now, of course, both malware makers and actually, for example, game developers or financial applications, they try to prevent themselves from being analyzed, right? They don't want people looking at the internals of the application. Games don't want people to modify resources inside the application because then you would probably be able to cheat. And malware, of course, doesn't want you to figure out how it's actually working or how you can protect yourself against this. So when you perform dynamic analysis, you will often have to circumvent these anti-reverse engineering controls, which is, of course, very fun to do. So if we perform dynamic analysis, what do we expect to find? So I've divided the slide into two, for malware and for application security, because those are the main two reasons of why you would analyze an application. Maybe a third one is to cheat in games, but let's not discuss that one in this webcast. So malware. It's possible that it has hard-coded keys somewhere in the application and that they're really easy to find, and that static analysis helps you with this. However, if stuff is obfuscated or really properly protected, then it will be much easier to figure out the keys that are used, for example, during a ransomware attack, if you use dynamic analysis. You can simply wait for the relevant encryption code to be called and then see, okay, which key is now part of the, which key is in the parameters or which key is in the register of the CPU. Right. Detection avoidance. So this is maybe a little bit counterintuitive because if we want to run the application, we have to get around the detection controls, of course. And it would make more sense maybe to do it statically. But for example, let's say we have a piece of malware that tries to see if it's running in a virtual machine. So by monitoring all the file system requests, you can actually detect if it's probing for specific files to be there. So as long as you put the correct hooks and that you know which APIs are being called, you will always have input on what the next step would be to circumvent these anti-reverse engineering controls. If it tries to find the SU binary to figure out if the device is rooted, then you know, okay, I now have to move the SU binary, or I have to take some precautions so that the application doesn't detect the presence of the SU binary. Endpoints, of course, if you want to figure out the command and control of the malware, we need the endpoints. Once again, it's just much easier to get that man in the middle position and just see normal behavior or see the normal communication between the malware and the backend instead of doing that statically. Downloaded code, it's easier to just wait for the malware to download extra code and execute it than to figure out what that code would be or how it could be used, or downloading it manually and then figuring out how to decrypt it, how to decode it, how to load it, all that stuff. So those are things where dynamic analysis can really help you. Application security, on the other hand, the angle is different here because, of course, you're trying to protect the application. A lot of vulnerabilities for mobile applications are typically found on the backend, but there are some controls, of course, that you also have to properly enforce on the front end. Otherwise, the MASVS wouldn't have 80 controls. One of these is insecure file storage. So let's say you have a username password field and a remember me button. If you check the remember me button, the application stores your username password on your SD card as a text file. That would be horrible, of course. So insecure file storage is a really important one on a device that's being used by many different applications, some of which can be trusted, some maybe not. Backend vulnerabilities, again. So of course, get that man in the middle position, just evaluate the traffic, play around with it, and score some bug bounty prizes. Information leakage in other ways. Maybe the application actually broadcasts sensitive information to all of the other applications on the device. That's possible. Maybe their logging wasn't turned off, and all of your sensitive information is actually just printed out into the Android logs or the iOS logs. You don't really want that, of course. And then finally, interpreted code. I put this in here because this is a good example of how dynamic analysis can help you examine hybrid applications, so applications that contain web views with HTML code. And I'll come back to that in a later slide. Right. So I said that applications can download code at runtime, which is, of course, a quite dangerous thing to do. So on Android, this is perfectly possible. So an application can just download extra DEX files, which are just compiled code, or shared libraries, which are native code, so shared objects in C. You can just download these from a C2C server and execute them. Now, if you want your application to be on Google Play, so the official Android application store, that's not allowed. The thing is, so it's a policy, it's not a technical control. So the Android operating system doesn't prevent you from doing this. The check actually happens in the dynamic analysis or static analysis that Google performs before accepting your application to the Play Store. This means that it's possible to circumvent this, and the next slide has a very good example of this. And it's also by default allowed on third-party app stores because they just don't have the resources to stop this behavior, to scan all of these applications. It's already difficult for Google, so never mind third-party app stores with just a tiny piece of the resources that Google has. Why is this bad? Well, of course, you can use a benign application that serves as a dropper for malware. So you have a nice little Angry Bird game, but in the right conditions, you can it just downloads extra malware and starts attacking other applications, which you don't want. On iOS, it's a little bit different since all of code needs to be signed by Apple. So yeah, there's one exception, JavaScript. So JavaScript inside a web view, of course, is not signed by Apple. It's loaded dynamically, but this is the only exception. All the other code needs to be signed by Apple, either directly through the App Store or through enterprise certificates or through your developer certificates. So viruses typically don't, malware doesn't have the chance to actually download extra code. So in that regard, iOS is much more secure. So this is an example of a piece of malware, the chamois malware. It's quite a complex piece of malware, and this is an image from a presentation from Maddie Stone. She works at Google's Project Zero team, and she has a very nice talk on reverse engineering the chamois malware. As you can see, it's a really complicated malware. It starts with a normal APK file, so an Android package. It loads a jar file, so it loads extra Java code. The Java code then has a base64 blob of the next stage, so of a native ELF file. The ELF file then performs anti-debugging checks, so only if it thinks it's not being monitored will it continue with the next stage. And only then you actually start handling the actual chamois malware or the chamois framework. So you once again have an ELF file, which in turn loads another jar file. So it's back and forth between native and interpreted code, so Java code. There's also updates from the C2 server, so it does update itself. And it has multiple modules, ELF files, jar files. All of them do something different. All of them are really impressive. All of them are highly obfuscated, and they all speak to each other. And as soon as something goes wrong, the malware just stops, because then probably it's being monitored or something. And the chamois malware actually makes it into the Google Play Store quite often. It first appeared, I think, in 2016, and it re-emerges every year. Right after Maddie Stone had her talk at, I think, either Black Hat or DEF CON, just a week after, the malware developers had already pushed out a new version based on what Maddie Stone already knew in her talk, or what she told the audience. The total infection is in the hundreds of millions of devices, so it's a huge malware, and it's really a plague for the Google Play Store. And the end goal of the chamois malware is actually to perform ad fraud and premium text fraud. So apparently there's a lot of money to be gained there, because developing such a malware, of course, it takes a lot of investment and development effort. Right, so which tools are we going to use to perform dynamic analysis? Once again, this is just a brief summary of all the tools that are available. I won't be able to go over all of them, but I will give you a nice introduction and go in depth on a few of them. So first, let's talk about Android. There are a few native tools that you can use. So they're being provided by either Android itself, or by the operating system, or by Google to interact with Android apps. You also have frameworks. So frameworks allow you to build stuff on top of it, either through modules for Exposed, for example, or entire applications in case of Frida. And if you haven't heard of Frida already, you will be happy to hear that I do have some slides on Frida, and it's an awesome framework. So after today, you'll have a very powerful tool in your arsenal. So Frida-based tools, there are a lot of good Frida-based tools, and I will explain a bit the difference between those tools. Right. So on Android devices, you have direct access to a shell. You just go into the developer options, you enable ADB, you enable the developer options, basically, and you connect it with a USB cable. And using ADB, you automatically can get a shell. Now, by default, you will be a normal user, and that user is actually a different user than all of the users that are used to run the different applications. So by default, your shell is not that useful. You can interact with applications, you can start applications. There are a bunch of tools installed by default on the Android shell. But for a dynamic analysis point of view, that's not really that useful. So what do we do? Well, we root the device, and we become the root user who does have access to everything. So once we do have the super users, then we can just take a look at all of the local storage of all the applications, and see what they are storing locally. Two other tools that aren't used that often, unless you go into really advanced malware or really advanced reverse engineering controls. But they're the JDWP and GDB. So the Java Debug Wife protocol, it's a default protocol to debug Java applications. The Android, of course, uses the Android runtime, which is a modified version of a Java runtime, but there are a lot of similarities. And you can also use that protocol to actually interact with Android applications. You can only do this if the application has been compiled in debug mode. So that means the debug equals true in the manifest. But it's also really easy to just download an application, change the debug flag, reinstall it, and then ta-da, your application is debuggable. There's also a nice project called Small-IDEA, which actually allows you to debug that application based on the Smalley code. And the Smalley code is the assembly that's being executed by the Android runtime. So you can actually just step through the Java code as it's being executed and then monitor return values, parameters, all that stuff. So that's a very nice tool. Yeah, if you have native files in an Android application, then of course you can use the GNU debugger. Just compile it for Android, throw it on the Android device, and then connect remotely with a local GDB client, and you can start instrumenting the native files. So quite a separate skill to have, so low-level debugging, but depending on what you want to do with your mobile applications or what you will face, it's definitely a really good skill to have. All right, next up is Exposed. So before Frida was around, Exposed was a really popular framework, including for security analysts, because it allowed you to inject code into other applications quite easily. It still exists, and it still does that. But it's mostly used for end users who want to modify certain aspects of applications. For example, to improve the battery management, to maybe bypass local restrictions for a premium app, maybe to cheat in games, to download Snapchats while they are being shown on your screen to get around the temporary nature of the Snapchats. So stuff like that. It does, of course, require a rooted device because it actually modifies the zygote process, which spins up all of the other. So each application on Android is actually a child process of the zygote process, and it modifies the zygote process so that every time an application is loaded, it actually injects an additional jar file or an APK file into the application, and they can use reflection and introspection to modify parts of the application. How do you add stuff to Exposed? Well, you create your own Android application. So you implement the interface provided by Exposed. And it works. It works pretty well, actually, but it is rather slow. Every time you update your injected code, you actually have to recompile the application, push it to the device, and maybe even reboot. I'm not sure, but in any case, it's quite a slow development. But there is a larger community around it, mostly of mod makers. So you do get some support. Now, as I said, Exposed used to be really hot stuff until Frida came along. So Frida is a dynamic instrumentation toolkit that works on many different platforms: Windows, macOS, iOS, Android, Linux, a bunch of others even. So it's a bit of a weird concept. So it actually injects an entire JavaScript runtime into a running process. So either the V8 engine or duct tape, which both parse JavaScript or TypeScript. So there's an entire virtual machine injected into a running process. You can inject into Windows processes, Linux processes, iOS, Android, it all works. So how do you then interact with the runtime? Well, you create JavaScript code. So the JavaScript code is being pushed to the virtual machine inside the application. It gets executed, and then you get return values. You can create your own scripts, which can interact with the application itself, with the operating system, with other applications. You can also get scripts created by the community. So there's a nice code share project, which just lists a bunch of typical scripts that you could use during dynamic analysis. For example, there's a script that will print out all of the file accesses that an application uses. And there are a lot of security tools built on top of Frida. So writing your own scripts or borrowing scripts is one thing, but you also have nice tools that actually combine a bunch of those scripts and make it much nicer to use. An additional interesting thing about Frida is that you can use it on a rooted and on a non-rooted device. Why is that possible? Well, you actually inject the entire runtime into the application, so you can actually take an application from your device, just put the JavaScript virtual machine in there, repackage it, sign it, install it again. And if the application doesn't have any anti-reverse engineering controls, it will just run on the device and you will be able to connect to it. So what can you do? Well, you can do a lot of instrumentation. So you can inspect both arguments and return values. So you can see both for Java methods and for native methods, what the arguments are to the methods, and also what the return value is, right? You can also change those parameters. You can change the return value, and you can actually just change the entire implementation of the method. So if you want to disable an entire security framework check, well, just replace the method by return true, and off you go. Since you are running inside the application, you're actually also confined by what that application can do. So indeed, you can interact with other applications because that's what applications can do on Android. You can also create custom instances or new instances of different classes. You can call local methods. You can just be the actual application. And you can also access your own local storage or your own keychain that you have access to. However, if you're using Frida, well, you won't have access to the local storage of other applications, of course. So you're still confined by the user that's actually running the application and also by the application's permissions. So if you want to take a picture through Frida, well, the application actually has to have access to get to the camera, and the user actually has to give permission to use that feature. So two tools built on Frida. There are many, many more, but these are the most interesting ones. So on the left, we have Objection, which is the runtime mobile exploration framework. It's a terminal interface, and I will show you in a small demo exactly how it works. It bundles a lot of those useful commands in a very nice user interface. For example, disabling SSL pinning to get that man in the middle position, bypassing root detection, so bypassing anti-reverse engineering controls, bypassing biometric controls. So if an application has not properly implemented biometric security, then by using this bypass, you can immediately tell that the application is vulnerable to a specific kind of attack. So you know that it's not correctly using the cryptographic security of the Android device. So that's Objection, a really nice tool. And then on the right, we have House. It's a more recent tool built by NCC Group. And it has a GUI. So you can, if you launch it, you can go to a website, which is spawned. And the main goal of House is actually to help you create your own Frida scripts. So it's less useful for a general security audit, where you just want to see what is the application doing and how is it interacting with other applications. But it is really useful for reverse engineering malware or mobile games, which typically require very custom hooks in different places to be able to get them to even work on a rooted device. It does have a few built-in commands, and it does do a bit of monitoring, but the main focus is just to make it really easy for an analyst to create their own Frida scripts. All right, so small demo. Let's see, this is still working. No. Okay, I mixed up my cables, so give me a second. Cable. Just put it here. Weird. All right. Oh, this should work because this is plugged in. This is nope. Hang on. All right, that's weird. So I won't be able to show the screen, which is here, but doesn't really matter. You can. The important stuff is here inside the terminal anyway. All right, so wait, still messed something up. Too many cables. See, all right. All right, so this one. All right, so here I have the device connected to my my laptop. Try one more. No, okay. Simply by typing adb shell, you get a shell on the device. Maybe make this larger. I hope that's readable to everybody. Right now, I'm a normal user, a shell user. So if I try to list all of the applications that are installed on the device, I actually get permission denied because I don't have the proper access to list all of those things. However, if I become the super user mode, then I do, of course, have access to all of those things. For example, let's go into Proxy Droid. Right, so I can see all of the files that it's got stored, for example, shared preferences. Let's do a cut here. All of these are local passwords, so no worries. So you can just monitor the file system while the application executes. Nothing fancy here, of course, it's just a normal terminal. So next up, so exit from the user, exit from the shell. I have Frida installed here. So there you go. So it wants to have some information on which application I want to attack, of course. There's a nice tool included with Frida, which is called Frida PS, so to view the processes. And then I want to see everything for USB, so -U. And these are all the processes that are currently running on my Android device, and I can choose one to attach to. Now, I only care about the applications, so I add the A flag, and then I can see, for example, I want to attach to, oh, application isn't open yet. Where is it? Right, this one. So on my device, I have a Notepad application open, so Notepad free over here. So I want to perform some instrumentation on this one. So Frida USB file name is the package name, and that's it. All right, so this is the barebone Frida, and now the application is actually waiting for me to continue. So you can do early instrumentation right now, but I will let the application boot up, and then difficult to see, but now the application has started. Right now, you can't really do a lot because, of course, the API is available to you, but you don't have any real Frida scripts that are that are installed. So you could do, for example, process.enumerate modules, like this one. So that's just using the API that Frida makes available to you. And then normally your script would do more with this. For example, this one lists all of the shared objects, so all the native files that are currently loaded by the application. So that's Frida, but it's much more useful to use one of the tools built on top of Frida, for example, objection. So I can do the same thing with objection, and the syntax is a little bit different, but it works the same. So objection, it automatically goes for USB. I have to tell it the package name, of course, and then what I want to do, which is explore. Objection also allows you to inject Frida into an APK file, for example, which would be patch APK, for example, and then so it has a little bit of other functionality, but in this case, just can use explore. Wait for it to boot. All right, same thing. So once again, terminal access. So no GUI, or no nice GUI, but there is already some nicer autocomplete and all that stuff. So where are we? So pw print. We're currently inside, well, data, that's a symlink to that same location. And we're currently inside a files directory. Is there something here? Yes, there is. Get that out of the way. So a few files, and if I go up one directory, so this is the main directory that we saw earlier, including the shared preferences, for example. If I would go to that data folder again, I still wouldn't have access, of course, because Frida is injected into the Notepad application, and the Notepad application doesn't have the proper rights to view all of that information. So let's go back to one of the directories that it does have access to. For example, the files directory. Yep. And let's check out the shared preferences. All right. And let's download this file. So file download, shared preferences. No. There you go. So now it's successfully downloaded it from the application, through the application to my local device. And then I can do got shared preps.xml. And then that's a system command on my local host that actually shows the file. Now, there are a bunch of other commands. For example, for Android, we have SSL pinning disable. Oh. Disable. Where it will actually hook into different trust managers, so Java trust managers, which handle the validation of a certificate chain. And it will just hook these methods and make sure that they never throw an error, so that they never complain that they see a wrong certificate. You have, just playing around for a bit. You have hooking commands, so you can actually type out an entire class like I did here. So watch class method, specific class name, the get password method. So you can easily also create hooks through this through these plugins. Viewing the key store, list. Don't think this application has anything, but these are nice scripts to have when you want to investigate how the application works. Yeah, that's enough for this demo. So I mentioned earlier that dynamic analysis is also quite interesting for those hybrid applications. So hybrid applications, actually, they have web views, and those web views can be debugged with Chrome. However, the developer actually has to enable this on their web view, and well, they typically wouldn't do that, of course. But with Frida, we can actually tell the web view to enable that feature. So we can actually use Frida to call the set web contents debugging enabled, and then suddenly Chrome will be able to find our web view. So I also have a small demo of this. In my directory here, I have hook.js. which is a custom Frida script. And it enables remote debugging of Android web views at runtime. So I'm not going to go through the entire script, but it basically calls the set up contents debugging enabled every time that a new web view is loaded. So I'm going to use Frida to run the application and with the hook. So still have the package name. No. Let's see. I have a nice web view test. This one. So Frida. Package name hook.js. All right. So yeah, you can't see it on screen, but this is basically a browser. It has a URL bar and then a web view that shows that page. So let me load the page. Hold on. Mispressed. Can't see that again. Yes. All right. So you can see execution completed. So the custom Frida script actually did its job. And if I now go to Chrome/inspect, I see a bunch of things I have at home here on my Wi-Fi network. But I also see my mobile device. And then here inside the application, I see that I loaded the Enviso website, which I can now inspect. And on the left, you can see a live view of the web view that is being being used. And you have the typical Chrome development tools here. If my zoom bar moves, I'd move it down a bit. So you can actually see what it's calling, which JavaScript is running. So all the typical stuff you have during a web assessment or while web developing. You can add JavaScript breakpoints, all of that stuff. So if you have a hybrid application, that's definitely an interesting thing to take a look at. Right. iOS, and I'll have to go a little bit quicker because I'm a little bit behind on time with all my cable management. So the native support is more limited. You do have shell access if you actually install a jailbreak and if you install an OpenSSL server. I'll actually go through the tools immediately. So you do have shell, you do have GDB. So if you install a specific repository in Cydia, you can install the GNU debugger and follow along applications that way. But all of this, of course, requires a jailbroken device. While that's not necessarily needed for Android. Cycrypt is a very interesting thing. It was and is developed by was it Jake Freeman? So the actual developer of Cydia store, and he also created then Cycrypt. It also parses JavaScript syntax, and it allows you to interact with iOS applications. There is a version for Android, but it's much more limited. I think you can only do monitoring and not changing implementation at runtime. And it does work. It still works for iOS 13 even, which is impressive because it started very early in the scene. So the tool has been around for many years. It's a fun tool, but just like Exposed, it's more used to tweak your device, to tweak your home screen on iOS instead of actually performing security audits with it. Just like Frida, all of the changes you do, of course, are at runtime, are in memory. So as soon as you restart the applications, all of those modifications are gone. Some various tools that are interesting to use on iOS applications. So SSL kill switch, it's a nice one. It actually, so the goal of SSL kill switch is to disable SSL pinning. And SSL pinning is making sure that if you man in the middle the application and it doesn't recognize the certificate that you're using, which has to be a very specific certificate, then it will just not set up that SSL connection. So if you want to man in the middle an application, you typically have to get around this. And SSL kill switch it hooks really low into the iOS stack, into the sockets, and it actually prevents the application from even knowing that an SSL connection needed to be verified. This works on 90% of the applications out there. You have some other applications, for example, anything built with Flutter currently, that just implement their own TCP IP stack and their own SSL stack. So of course, SSL kill switch won't modify anything there because it just injects the default TCP IP stack of iOS. But still, over 90% of the applications can just be bypassed with SSL kill switch. Dump decrypted. So if you want to perform static analysis on an iOS application, well, you need a decrypted version of the application. So every time you download an application from the App Store, it's actually encrypted, and so it's encrypted on device. And when you run it, it actually gets decrypted in memory and then run. So dump decrypted will actually dump parts of the memory into a nice IPA file that you can then use to modify or to explore using static analysis. iOS deploy, it's basically terminal way of doing everything that Xcode can do. So you can install applications, you can list applications, you can start applications that as a debuggable application, so that you can attach a debugger. That's only possible on a jailbroken device or if you resign the application. But iOS deploy is a very convenient way of doing whatever Xcode can do, but with less restrictions. Keychain dumper. So the main local storage or secure storage of iOS is, of course, the keychain, which is secured by the secure enclave, which is really well protected. But of course, you also want to know what's inside of those applications. Keychain dumper is a very nice tool because it gives you the entire keychain, so not just from one application, but just the entire dump of the keychain, including anything that's protected with biometrics. So that's really interesting to see what is actually stored on your device. You will typically find a lot more information than you were expecting. And if that's something that interests you, then definitely check out the 585 course, which is the mobile forensics course. Right, we know objection now, so it has modules for iOS as well. The bypass biometric, dumping the keychain, readingplists, so everything you want to do on iOS. You don't have house on iOS, even though it's built, well, on FIDA, so it could technically work, but the main focus of house is Android, and the main focus of passionfruit is iOS. Passionfruit is a little bit more focused on monitoring and a little bit less on creating your own scripts, but it is still rather limited. You can dump the keychain and you can browse storage, so all of the things that objection can actually do. One nice thing of passionfruit is actually that you can do a dump of the layout of the application. So if you want to get the value of a specific UI element, for example, or you want to figure out what exactly you want to modify with your scikit script to tweak a graphical user interface, for example, then passionfruit is really nice for that. Hybrid applications. So of course they're hybrid, so it's the exact same setup on Android as on iOS. All the hybrid applications on iOS actually use the same renderer, so the same UI web view. So that also means that if you install Chrome or different browsers on your iPhone, they're using the exact same rendering engine as Safari. Safari has a little bit of advantage because they can use some private APIs that none of the other competitors can. But it doesn't really matter which browser you're using. They're all using Safari core in the end. If you have a MacBook with Safari installed, you can also use Safari to actually connect to to those web views on in your application. But it only works if the application is debuggable, which makes sense. Of course, you don't want to have somebody attached to any web view in any application. Now, there are two solutions to get around this. Either you repackage the application. So this works on non-jailbroken phones. Now, you do need a jailbroken phone first to get the decrypted application, for example, with dump decrypted. But then you can repackage the application with your own certificate, with your own development certificate, and actually spawn the application in debug mode. Or if your iPhone is jailbroken, you can just run the app as debuggable, and then once again connect with Safari. All right, there you go. So that's a very quick and high-level overview of the different tools that are available for iOS and Android. As you might be able to tell, I'm quite a big fan of Frida. It's a really nice tool. It's actively being developed by Ole. I can't pronounce his full name. Awesome guy. He also provides awesome support. And actually, there's the company he works for, Now Secure. They have a commercial interest in keeping Frida alive. So that's why it's a really good thing to invest into skill-wise. Because you see a lot of these projects, actually, if they don't have a commercial backing, that the developer, well, they lose interest, or they just don't have time enough to keep up with all of the mobile platforms, all the new versions. So that's another good reason to choose Frida for your dynamic analysis and instrumentation. I don't think we have any questions currently. If you have a question, now's the time. I'll wait for a minute.
Jeroen, as we're waiting for any questions that do come in, did you have any closing statements or anything else you'd like to share to the audience?
Well, the main subject of my previous talk, so static analysis, was, well, the conclusion was that there are so many mobile frameworks being developed right now, so Xamarin, Unity, React Native, Flutter, that it becomes really difficult to perform static analysis. You need to be able to read C code, Java code, JavaScript code, Dart code, low-level C code. All right, I have a question. So that's really interesting. And also for dynamic analysis, it becomes even more difficult because dynamic analysis tools for third-party applications are even less mature. So it's really a constant challenge, which is, I really love that, a nice puzzle every day to push the tools to new limits and to figure out what we can do. Oh, so only a lot of questions. What is my preferred mobile phone for daily use? I have an Android phone. I love it. I love the freedom I can do with it. I have a Galaxy S10. Don't really like the Samsung bloatware, but from a hardware perspective, it's quite all right. But in practice, like iPhones are more secure, especially malware wise. So I told my parents to get an iPhone just because it's much easier and they can't do anything wrong with it. What if Frida Universal Script didn't work for jailbreak? Can you suggest another Frida script? No. So then the fun starts and you actually have to reverse engineer the application and figure it out yourself. If a universal script doesn't work, then it means they have had something custom and they're actually actively trying to stop you from removing that jailbreak detection. Do I have a list of resources where we could find more information? So definitely check out the Mobile Security Testing Guide. It's over 1,000 pages. It has all of the tools I mentioned here, a bunch more. That's definitely a great place to start. Or of course, join us on the 575 course. Is there a greater security risk with older Android devices? Yeah, all devices don't get security updates. They will find exploits for example, for the Broadcom chips. And if your firmware is not updated, it becomes really easy to root a device. And that, of course, makes it, well, a liability to have. So if your device no longer gets security updates, then I would definitely buy a new one. Is Apple and App Store still better at keeping out dynamically downloaded code? Yes, so it's impossible to do that. You can only run JavaScript code in applications downloaded from the Apple and Apple App Store, simply because there is a very low-level signature verification that says, well, all the code that is part of runnable memory, it actually has to be signed correctly. And if it's not, it won't be run. So many questions currently. No, it's the mobile security testing guide from OWASP. So it's an open source project by me and some other guys. What is the job market like for mobile app penetration testing? Booming business. Every company wants to have a mobile application, and they all want to have a new version each year. So there's a lot of work to be had there. What else? I think that's most of it. Yeah, so somebody says, I did the course 1.5 years ago. Do I have updates? Do I have access? Yes, so please go to the normal. There's a download link somewhere in the course on day 1, slide 10 or something. Download that file and you will have further instructions. So you can have access to it. All right, then back to Jessica.
All right, thank you. That's all the time that we do have for today. Thank you to our speaker, Jeroen, for that great presentation, which helps brings this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcast. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.